Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa lah. Amma ba'd, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. How's everybody doing? Alhamdulillah. So today we're taking a look, we're still on the final major section of this book, which are fil qawaid al-usuliyya at-tashri'iyya, which means the principles of religious legal maxims. And we're taking a look at the second and third of these, the two different ones. And the reason is because one of them is very brief. So the second legal maxim is about Allah's rights and the responsible servant's rights. And then the third one, which is what we're going to spend most of our time on, is on the where is ijtihad legitimate. So with regards to the second legal maxim about Allah's rights, we've covered it, most of these details earlier, but just as a brief summary, since this was already clarified previously, it is Allah's right that we as human beings take care of both, as in two things. Number one, society in general, يعني مصلحة الجماعة, and the individual person himself, مصلحة المكلف الخاصة. So simply put, Allah wants us to live in a way that is both beneficial for society and for ourselves. And the rules of Islamic law reflect this noble objective. So that's the goal. It's not like, do I benefit myself? It's not an either or situation, basically. It's not either I benefit myself or I benefit society. No. The Sharia is designed in such a way where it's supposed to be beneficial to you as an individual and by extension everybody as well, inshallah. Like as you benefit others as well, and everybody flourishes together. It's a win-win situation. That's the goal. Anyway, that section, there's more details to it, but since we covered most of it earlier, I'm going to move forward to the third legal maxim, which is where is ijtihad legitimate? So what is ijtihad first and foremost? Coming from, juhud, right? Juhud means effort. That's where you get the word jihad, the big J word, if you will, right? Jihad really just means struggle, usually in reference to military conquest and so forth, but can be an internal struggle as well. So jihad can be, versatile in that perspective. But ijtihad means what? Extracting legal rulings from evidences in Islamic source materials. So when you are going into the source materials and then you're extracting rulings. Now obviously it takes an expert to do so, in the same way you would imagine any field. Like you wouldn't trust a random person to read a bunch of books about medicine, to say, here's a library on medicine, now you can operate on me. You'd be like, no thank you, I don't want you to operate on me. It's, just because good for you, you have a library, I don't care, right? So in a similar fashion, you want someone who's trained, someone who actually has the credentials to do so. So ijtihad is always necessary. In terms of, is it necessary, do we even need it or not? Ijtihad is always necessary because new circumstances must always be evaluated in light of Islamic law to know how to behave. So in other words, it's never like you're ever going to be done with ijtihad. There's always going to be new circumstances and therefore new, specialists and scholars to help us navigate whatever the new circumstances may be. This happens in politics all the time. Different countries, they go through different circumstances. They want to know, based on our specific circumstances, how do we deal with this position? Same thing with medicine. There's a whole fiqh regarding that. And there's so many fields. I mean, it never ends. Ijtihad is a communal obligation, fard kifaya. It's a communal obligation upon those who are qualified to do so. So if one person does it, then the rest of the group is exempted. If nobody does it, the whole group is guilty. Similar to the adhan, if you want to have a simple analogy, we're supposed to establish the adhan along with establishing the salawat, right? That's part of establishing a masjid and the 5 daily prayers is establishing the adhan. If one person does it, then the adhan is made. You don't need everybody to do it, right? One person does it, it's good. If nobody does it, then you're all sinful. Why haven't you established the adhan? You guys get the point? So that's a simple analogy, but in a similar fashion, and the same thing works for police, there has to be a certain group policing, and if there isn't that group that exists, then everybody's going to have chaos. Same thing with doctors. Some people have to become doctors. Some people have to establish hospitals. If you don't have that in a society, everything's going to crumble. So these are all considered, you could say, fard kifaya. Whether it be the fire department, etc. Things like this, right? There's going to have to be people who specialize in this. Same thing with when it comes to the ulama, the fuqaha, the people of ijtihad, the mujtahidun, the people who are going to give us our rulings and help clarify. There is no ijtihad when explicit text already clarifies the ruling. In fact, there's a particular qaida fiqhiyya, there's a particular legal maxim that states, لا مساغ للاجتهاد في مورد النص. There's no permission for legal rulings in the face of source material. So in other words, there is no idea of saying, listen, I know black and white, this is, let's say, haram, or this is, this is what I should do, but like, hey, let me go to the mufti to see if he can wiggle me out of this. That type of idea is very dangerous. We shouldn't go fatwa shopping till we find one deviant guy who's going to tell you what you want to hear. No, when things are clear-cut, they're clear-cut. But of course, in Islam, there are other circumstances which allow for wiggle room. So let's keep going. So regarding, yes, where is ijtihad legitimate? However, as long as the text isn't qat'iyyu thubut and qat'iyyu dalala. So again, qat'iyyu thubut means that qat'iyyu thubut means that it is very clear in terms of its transmission. Either it's from the Quran or from the authentic sunnah. That's qat'iyyu thubut. Or qat'iyyu dalala means the wording is so clear that it can only be understood in one way. The dalil for it is so evident that there's no other ways to understand it. So as long as the text isn't that way, then there is possibility for ijtihad. If the text is dhanni thubut, as in you're still not sure if it's authentic or not, then the scholars of hadith, the muhaddithun, will try to determine its authenticity. So there's still room there for work to be done. And if it's dhanni dalala, if it's questionable how the text could be understood, then the scholars of fiqh will try to determine whether the text is a command versus a recommendation, or whether it's general to all times or specific to a certain circumstances, whether it's understood literally or whether the expression used can be understood figuratively, and so on and so forth. So there's different circumstances where the ulama would figure out. So these are the two basic concepts are, is it clear in terms of transmission, qat'iyyu thubut? Is it clear in terms of meaning, qat'iyyu dalala? Or is it dhanni thubut, dhanni dalala, and therefore there needs to be more work in those areas. If there's no explicit text for a given circumstance, which that often happens, right? Some new technology shows up, right? And now there's obviously no text for this. So in that case, if there's no explicit text for a given circumstance, then a mujtahid uses previously discussed logical devices to shed light on how to deal with it, such as, and we talked about these in detail when we first began this, we talked about qiyas. You make an analogy, right? There's istihsan, there's al-maslaha al-mursala, there's urf, and there's istishab. So these were the ones that we talked about in detail in previous classes. So hopefully that's clear. That's, if you don't have a clear text about a particular issue, you're going to have to use those devices to transfer the ruling and figure out what applies and what doesn't. Moving on. What qualifies a person for ijtihad? Wallahu ta'ala alam, there seems to be 6 points. Well, this is a topic of discussion in and of itself. There are many different scholars that say, you need so many qualifications. There's lists that certain scholars have. But of course, as we said from the beginning, this is Al-Wajiz fi Usul al-Fiqh by Wahab al-Zuhaili. We're covering a particular book. So this author, his opinion is that these are the 6 points that you have to have. And again, I'm sure you can find other scholars that say, no, 10 points or this many points or whatever the case is. But in terms of this author, he says, number 1, fluent in Arabic, familiar with the Arabic literature, rhetoric, rhetorical devices, balagha and style, and knowing prose and poetry. You have to understand the language in depth. Number 2, you have to be knowledgeable in Usul al-Fiqh, which is what we're going over currently. Number 3, you have to be knowledgeable of the legal Quranic verses. So you have to know, this is actually why a lot of, I've heard, I don't know, anyway, I've heard that certain schools, they don't force you to become a hafiz to graduate, but they do ensure that you've memorized the surahs that have the most ahkam, the most rulings in it. Like for example, Baqarah and especially Nisa, Surah An-Nisa, etc. Like they make sure that, look, if you haven't become a hafiz, you have to at least memorize these. Why? Because you're going to go back to your country and after you graduate and you're going to be the mufti, you're going to be the sheikh and everyone's going to look to you. You better know these ayat. You better have memorized them, understood them. So it's very important. So you have to have knowledge of the legal Quranic verses, the vocabulary, their context, and the differences of opinion regarding their application. These verses are few and deal with subjects such as al-ibadat, worship of course, al-mu'amalat, business or human interactions, you could say al-uqubat, punishments, ahwal al-usrah, family law, and علاقة الدولة الإسلامية بغيرها من الدول والأفراد في الداخل والخارجي. So at first I just put the word politics to summarize all that, but then I thought someone might wonder what does that actually translate to. So the translation is the Islamic State's engagement with other states and other individuals, both domestically and abroad, both internally and internally. Now, so those are the first 3. Number 4. You have to have knowledge of hadith, specifically regarding law. Of course, there are many ahadith that talk about many different things, but you have to know the ahadith that deal with law, Islamic law. This includes knowledge of takhrij. Takhrij means determining the authenticity, right? Kharaja is to exit. Kharraja is to make something exit. So now you're extracting, essentially. You're extracting something. That's how you extract to make sure that a hadith is authentic. It's called ilm al-takhrij, understanding whether it's authentic or not. So you have to have a basic understanding what makes a sanad, either mutawatir or sahih or da'if or mawdu', etc. So you also have to know the knowledge of nasikh wa mansukh. That means the abrogating and the abrogated. You have to understand, were there times where there was a ruling and then later on that was taken away, both in terms of Quran and Sunnah. And he recommends different books on this subject. An-Nasikh wal-Mansukh fil Quran li Abi Ja'far an-Nahas. This is one book that really deals with this topic. Another book he suggests, which in my studies, we had to go over some of this book, Mushkil al-Athar lil-Tahawi, by al-Tahawi. This book is, subhanAllah, very fascinating. So, Mushkil al-Athar, there are two narrations, an athar, right, or a hadith, it's a narration, and it's mushkil, it's a problem. So you find that this hadith says one thing, another hadith says another thing, and you're like, what's going on here? And al-Tahawi did a brilliant job of saying, well, let me explain to you what's actually going on here. So this was for a particular context, that was for another one. This one was for a particular time, that one's for another one. So mashallah, it's a very excellent text. And in terms of book recommendations for law from hadith, there is Subul al-Salam by San'ani. And then you have Nail al-Awtar by Ash-Shawkani. So you also have, that's number 4. Then you have to have number 5, knowledge of ijma', like when it occurred. And there's many books that deal with the topic of ijma', when it occurred amongst the time of the Sahaba. And then there's knowledge of the requirements for qiyas, how it has to be done. We actually went through that ourselves when we talked about qiyas. We went into a lot of detail about what is considered qiyas ma'al fariq, like, invalid, a false analogy versus a legitimate one. And then, of course, you have to have knowledge, and examples of this are knowledge of the state of people and knowledge of maqasid al-sharia. You have to know the state of people. Like, this is very important. One point that I think is very beneficial, if I could just take a quick anecdotal breath here, just a quick side comment. SubhanAllah, I remember one of my teachers, may Allah Ta'ala preserve him, from back in my hometown. He, mashallah, tabarakallah, you could tell that he was a real alim, a real scholar. And the reason why is because the young scholar, somebody walks up and says, what's the ruling for such and such such? The guy says, oh, it's this, because I read it in a book, and therefore, I know the answer, I know the hadith, I know the, whatever, the fatwa, so he just tells you the answer. This sheikh, mashallah, you could tell that he was, very deep with his knowledge. Why? Because the guy would come and say, what's the answer for this, this, this? He'd go, okay, hold on. Well, first of all, how old are you? Okay. Are you married? Okay. How much are you making? Okay. And then, are you living with your, and subhanAllah, he would ask so many questions about this person's whole life to understand, where are you coming from? Who are you as an individual? I need to understand who you are and what you're about, and, all these different factors about you personally, so I can really paint the context. Why? Because any fatwa has to respect the context of the person, of the circumstances, right? You have to know what you're talking about. You can't just give random answers and not really know, the state of the people, ahwal an-nas. And of course, maqasid sharia. So it could be that you have to understand what the sharia is aimed towards in general. Yes. And we talked about that, I think, 2 sessions ago. Anyway, the obligation and reward of ijtihad. What about the obligation and reward of it? Evidence that there's an obligation to have mujtahidun. Well, Allah Ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق لتحكم بين الناس بما أراك الله ولا تكن للخائنين خصيما. Indeed, we have revealed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the book in truth, so that you may judge between the people by that which Allah has shown you, and do not be for the deceitful an advocate. So this is a particular ayah saying, listen, you have revelation, now you have to give rulings to the people. You have to use what I have revealed to you, and you have to give rulings. So this is one idea. Allah Ta'ala says, this is much more general, but Allah says, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. So consider, O people of vision. This is obviously a very broad command, but still, you have to be people that reflect and consider how one set of rulings and ayat and hadith and circumstances can apply to ours today. And then the Prophet says, this is much more particular, إِذَا حَكَمَ الْحَاكِمُ فَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ أَصَابَ فَلَهُ أَجْرَانِ وَإِذَا حَكَمَ فَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ أَخْطَأَ فَلَهُ أَجْرٌ. That when a judge gives a decision, having tried his best to decide correctly what is right, trying his best to decide correctly, and he is right, then there are 2 rewards. Why? Because he tried his best and he got it right, he gets ajran, double reward. And if he gave a judgment after having tried his best and he tried his best to arrive at a correct decision, but he erred, he made a mistake, then he simply gets 1 reward. So clearly, this is emphasizing that you have to do it. Sometimes you might get it right, sometimes you might get it wrong, but you have to do your absolute best, and there's reward. As long as you tried your best, inshallah, there's going to be reward, and of course, there's probably going to be people who correct you later on, no problem, inshallah. Now, also, evidence that those who are unspecialized must ask the specialist. So obviously, there has to be specialists. If Allah Ta'ala specifically says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So ask the people of specialization if you do not know. This is a command that's mentioned twice in the Quran, that أهل الذِّكْر, the person who remembers that particular topic over and over and over again. That's called the specialist. If you keep on talking about, thinking about, dealing with whatever, construction, medicine, law, whatever the case is, that's how you become a specialist at that field. So Allah says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْر. Who is the guy who deals with this topic the most? He's going to be called the specialist, أهل الذِّكْر. So you have to go ask those people in all circumstances, and that applies to deen, of course, as well. Now, when it comes to division of ijtihad, there are two opinions. Is it possible that the mujtahideen get divided into different groups? That's the question. Do we divide up the specialists? So there's a yes and a no, two different opinions here. So the first answer, yes. There will always be scholars who specialize and excel in a given field, and these scholars depend on each other, right? I'm going to go to the muhaddith guy, and then go to the mufassir guy, and then go to the usuli guy. I'm going to go to different specialists, and then hopefully benefit from all of them. This is why it's encouraged to say, I don't know, la adri, right? The famous quote from Imam Malik when he was visited by somebody from so far away. He said, I traveled so long to ask you, I can't remember how many, something like 50 questions. And he just asked question after question, just kept saying, La adri, la adri. And the guy said, I came all this way with all these questions for all my people. And he's going to say, La adri the whole time? He goes, yeah. And he goes, what should I tell my people? He goes, go back and tell your people that Imam Malik says, I don't know. So that's it. I will not be pressured because I have to stand before Allah. So if the standard was that all scholars must be perfect in all fields, then nobody would ever say, I don't know. So clearly, the scholar still has to say, I don't know. And I don't know if this is a hadith, or if this is just a quote from a particular alim, but there's a nice quote that says that La adri is a shield. Saying I don't know is a shield. And that's so true, and that's so beautiful and such a powerful statement, because you protect yourself. You protect yourself with Allah. Ya Rab, I don't want to give the wrong answer. I'm going to shield myself. I don't know. I'm not responsible. Leave me alone. And then the other opinion is no, ijtihad doesn't divide, because once a scholar knows the base principles, those principles are applicable to other fields as well. So even if he doesn't have the answer to every question, his scholarly training can guide him to the answer. I wouldn't say that these two answers contradict each other. It's really just saying that you should go to specialists, but you should also know that if you've studied the basics of your deen and you have those 6 points that we mentioned earlier, then you don't have to just rely upon the specialist. You can actually get to his stage as well. You don't just have to go to him and say, tell me the answer. Rather, you can say, tell me the answer, now explain to me the answer, so that I can get to the same conclusion that you have, because I have the tools to get to your conclusion. I have the tools to understand what you did here and how you came up with this recipe, quote unquote. So it's not that these two opinions are really differing. It's really more like a timeline issue. At first, you go to the specialist, and then later on, you try to become like that guy, if you can, inshallah ta'ala. So long as you are, you have the base, as an alim, you have the base knowledge that's necessary to do so. Moving on, changing and opposing ijtihad. Very interesting idea, and this is the last slide, inshallah, for today. Can a mujtahid change his opinion? Yes, in light of new evidence, the scholar must follow the evidence where it leads. So of course, you give a fatwa, you realize it's wrong, new information comes to light, you should obviously follow the truth all the time. But then there's another answer, which again doesn't contradict it, but it just gives more nuance here. No, a judge, now this is more particular to an actual judge, right? Like actually in court. A judge who gives a verdict for person X that differs from the verdict he gave to person Y in the same circumstances doesn't nullify the judgment given to person Y, otherwise there'd be chaos. This is similar to the case of the people who are serving long jail sentences for a crime that is no longer illegal. Just to give an American example, I give the example of like possession of a large quantity of marijuana. That was something that the rulings for it have changed, but the people who were in jail are still in jail because they got put in jail at the time when the ruling was harsher, and now the ruling is much lighter. So you don't just keep on changing every time a new judgment is made. The legal maxim that describes this is what? Al-ijtihadu la yanqudu bimithlihi. That legal verdicts aren't nullified by their like. So yes, a judge gave one ruling to this guy, another judge gave one to that guy, and this guy says, hey, mine was harsher. That one gave a lighter one for that guy. So can we just take that guy's ruling and apply it to me? And the answer is no, not really. He gave you his own independent one. I mean, that's what it's going to be. Otherwise, you'd be constantly... anyway, and Allah knows best. طيب, inshallah, with that, inshallah, we close. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.